A proposed CrossCanada Pipeline getting some big support. New Brunswick's Premier, David Alward, has announced he's heading west next month to meet with his Albertan counterpart, Alison Redford, to express his enthusiasm for the project. So let's see how enthusiastic our next guest is on cross-country pipelines. And he's the Chief Executive Officer of Flax Energy, Jon Dwyer. Jon, good to see you.
I'm very enthusiastic.
You and I have talked about this before, and you
are
quite enthused about it, because what they're doing is they're taking a natural gas pipeline that goes across the top of the province.
They're going to reconstitute it, which I think is a very good idea. And I think it's a dynamically different discussion than Christy Clark versus what David Alward is looking for. Christy Clark has natural resources, has a huge, basin of natural gas that they're trying now to export to the ASEAN and other portions, Qatar and all the rest that they're battling with. But New Brunswick has a very small portion of natural resources, but they have the largest oil refinery in Canada and deep sea water ports where they can export all this oil to the rest of the world.
So basically what they're doing is, instead of importing it from wherever they get it, Saudi Arabia, which is more expensive oil,
absolutely,
they're bringing in cheap oil from Canada, they'll refine it and send it out.
And the good thing about it, it's not all oil sands oil. So a great majority of it's going to be light crude. So it really shows the diversity of Canada's oil basin and what we can actually create as a country. We tend to be very myopic. We look just at the oil sands, and that's something that's been perpetuated by the environmental movement. But the important thing to note is that this is a deal, in my opinion, that is very sustainable. Barack Obama talked all about renewable green energy for the first 2 years of his term. For the last 2 years, you've heard nothing. He's refining more oil in the United States than any president since Lyndon Johnson. And now he's talking all about green energy. And he's negating the idea of the Keystone XL pipeline. Christy Clark is being exceptionally selfish and saying she wants a portion to move that oil to Kitimat, BC, which is just unrefined oil. And I think this is something where we can actually have a Canadian product that's having a value-added result in terms of it being refined and then sent to the rest of the world. It's a slam dunk.
Okay, it's not quite a slam dunk, because Christy Clark effectively wanted to charge a tariff. You're bringing the oil across our province, and we want a piece of that. Will that happen? Not likely to happen in Saskatchewan, I wouldn't think, or Manitoba, or those kinds, but could it happen in Ontario and Quebec? It has to go through those two provinces to get to New Brunswick. You can have a champion on each end. It's the barbell.
Well,
That's the issue.
I think it's about who's going to play ball. Obviously, you're going to go through Manitoba. Churchill, Manitoba has a lot to be desired for in terms of their ability to procure oil and get that oil from Alberta. And so that's going to come up through the Rockies. So that's an NDP government. There's your first big problem. So you're going to get through Bradwell and Saskatchewan. I imagine that's not going to be a big deal. Now you're going to get into Ontario. Well, what are we going to look like with Kathleen Wynne? Is she going to allow it to go through the northern areas? Perhaps there may be concessions. But as soon as we get into Quebec, it's a very simple story, because they have two very large refineries, both in Quebec City and in Montreal. So we have to start to look at it in this very sectioned way, which, by the way, our forefathers tried to eliminate, by virtue of the Dominion of Canada.
And putting a railway across the whole country to unite the country.
But it's a shame we don't act that way. So, I think this is going to be incumbent on Kathleen Wynne making a serious decision. And I hope that since she let all the teachers and everybody else they made promises down to, that she'll help the oil pass through to New Brunswick.
But I guess the Premier of New Brunswick wants a commitment, if you will, that there'll be enough volume coming through. Because, I mean, to turn this thing around and convert the pipeline is a big capital endeavor.
Well, as well as the CrossCanada Pipeline Corporation, who's going to be paying for a great majority of it.
Right.
Because both Premier Alward and Premier Redford haven't been necessarily asked for money. I imagine they'll commit some to it. But, Alberta is something we don't think about as Alberta having some sort of decline in revenue. But they have, by virtue of the fact that we don't have the domestic infrastructure to properly export our unrefined oil, whether it be to Asia or to Europe or to other portions of the world. So
that's why we're getting a massive discount on our oil, as much as, what, 40–45%?
Yes, sir, absolutely. And it's an interesting time for Canadians and for the oil companies. And this is why I think it's so very important to look at this project as one that is really sustainable, because, I don't know if Barack Obama will allow Keystone XL to go through. I imagine Jim Flaherty is the truculent kind of guy who's smart enough to go out there to BC and say, listen, Christy Clark, figure it out, because this is a great opportunity for us to export as a country and to share in that high dollar value.
And he's not going to do it because there's an election coming in. It's probably a little bit of a charged issue, we'll say.
I was at the Toronto Board of Trade 125th annual dinner, and Rick Waugh, the CEO of Scotiabank, said he was with a group of folks from the Bank of Canada, and somebody said to him, voting on or relying on the dollar to go down in value is not a good economic plan. And our dollar is held up by our oil exports and our oil exploration, and how we're, you know, maybe not refining it here domestically, but the strength of our dollar really is relying on oil, in my opinion anyways. I don't know, you might
disagree. It's a petrocurrency, I agree with you.
It's a petrocurrency. So, and that's very good for all Canadians. And so I think Canadians need to start seeing it in that way. And this is a very domestic Canadian story, where we can start to understand the fact that Canada can not only produce it, but we can refine it. I think if we can get over the emotional hurdle of being an oil-producing country, it's going to be very good for our country as a whole.
It's long since been a fact of life. Listen, I just quickly wanted to comment on the inaugural address, because it seemed, as you pointed out, that President Barack Obama was very much pro-green. Is that good for your business?
My business in particular? Yeah. Yes, it is. I mean, you know, we'd like to think so. My company doesn't export anything to the United States, and you know, I run a company that's in the renewable energy business. So we make a product that, you know, is a replacement for oil-based products. But in my company and in my board of directors, and what we do when I go out and speak to folks is, it's not about identifying oil as evil. It's about having a very progressive and concurrent idea to how we're going to eliminate oil in the very long term. But for the next conceivably 30 to 40 years, oil is going to play a role in our lives. And I think that's the fallacy that Barack Obama is playing out to the American people and to everybody else who's watching. The fact that he's going to love oil at one minute and then hate it at the next. There has to be a very sane view of what oil does for us.
Isn't that exactly the message that Canadians have to get?
Absolutely.
Oil is not the bad thing. And
I agree.
I think we've got 180 years worth of oil sands oil. We're going to be dealing with this for a long time. Get over it.
Yeah. The moment we become proud of oil, and the fact that, you know, we are creating more environmentally sound practices for refining it and burning it, is the moment that Canada, I think, then graduates to a country that's capable of understanding what it's capable of on the international sphere. But until then, we are just lost in some sort of Freudian myth. I don't know.
John, always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Great to have you on here.